presentation of the key findings from the survey itself, and also providing you with some sort of things to think about and some possible opportunities moving forward. So yeah, hope you enjoy the webinar, and we'll get started now. Quickly about myself and about QCG. So my name's Peter Fairchild. I'm a senior consultant at QCG. Been with the company for 7 years or so. Also joined by my various colleagues on the line. So we've got Paula Hayes, Beth Wilrich, and Hattie Edwards, and you may well hear from them in the questions and answer session at the end. For those of you who don't know us particularly well, we are a reward and employee experience consultancy set up in 2000. And we provide a range of services across those two areas. So things like reward strategy and pay structure designs, benchmarking, job evaluation on the reward side, but also on the employee experience side. More recently, we've been opening new service lines, so things such as employee value proposition, diagnostics, performance management, changes in approaches and kind of reviews of systems. And we work with a wide range of organisations, both across the public and private sectors, which quite neatly made up our survey respondents. So just a quick introduction to what we did to the survey. So we ran the survey back in May in response to a number of conversations with clients that were kind of saying, well, we're thinking of doing this in terms of return to the workplace, but to be honest, we have no idea what others are doing. Not only in terms of the actual outcomes of the return to work plans, but also the plans themselves and what people are actually doing. So we kind of, through that, we found this appetite to sort of check on what others are doing and across many different areas. The survey itself, there was just over 100 respondents, and it's pretty much neatly cut 50%, almost 50% public sector and just over 50% private sector organisations. So the plan for this webinar is to summarise some of the key headlines and kind of think ahead to the implications of what that may mean, especially, as I said, with the kind of the imminent return to the workplace in terms of at least being able to sort of legally. So in terms of key headlines from the survey. So overall, many different areas that we covered, but the kind of pleasing and the positive impact that we saw from the results was that many organisations have really made the effort to put employees at the heart and at the centre of their return to the workplace efforts. So, you know, really being able to put them at the forefront and have them first in mind. This has been a really good opportunity to check in with employees over the past year or so. And have plans with, you know, individual preferences and circumstances at the front of those plans. This then has a kind of knock-on effect in terms of, so if employees now are more enabled to have more flexibility in the way they work, and obviously this survey touches more on those who have the opportunity to work remotely or work in the field or at the workplace. Therefore, that does kind of naturally bring a greater degree of accountability for those employees in the way that their work is measured. So it's less about the kind of inputs, the time, how the work is done, but more about the work itself and the output and the contribution that employees make. So all of this is a kind of really employee-centric approach to the return to the workplace, and that spans these different areas that I'm going to talk about now. So the first one is employee consultations. So the vast majority of organisations conducted many consultations with employees. It's been, again, a really positive, strong message in terms of all the client conversations we've had. The survey results themselves suggest that there's been a lot of touching in with employees and a lot of opportunities to connect with them. The majority of organisations, so 68% of organisations who responded to the survey, use at least 2 or more methods to do this. With just under a third of organisations using 3 or more methods, which includes kind of large-scale surveys, the shorter, sharper pulse surveys, one-to-ones between different groups of managers, employees, departmental briefings, and also town hall consultations. So the most common of those are the kind of the opinion surveys and the individual conversations. And again, this has been really heartening because obviously, you know, putting employees at the front of this is really core to the return to the workplace initiatives in the first place, but also it's been a really good opportunity to be able to engage with employees. Companies were doing the kind of one-off annual engagement surveys, asking the same questions all the time. How useful were the results was kind of open to challenge, but this has forced organisations to be quite innovative and agile in the way that they communicate and react to employee consultations. So a really positive message from this. One question going forward, I guess, especially as we've been doing this for specifically in terms of the pandemic and the return to the workplace for sort of 18 months now. So we are starting to hear bits and pieces of survey fatigue coming to play, and particularly if we continue to consult with employees as we do return to work throughout the autumn. So a question really is what is the most effective way to consult with employees moving forward, both in terms of the type of consultation that we have and also how frequent, and trying to avoid that survey fatigue. The next area is the influence of employee opinions. So nearly all organisations stated that employee input influence their plans, and at least somewhat influence plans, so at least to an extent. And there's been this shift, really, what we've seen anyway, from last year, 2020. So 2020, when the pandemic first happened, lots of organisations were kind of very hands-off and sort of saying, it's very much up to individual circumstances. You're saying to employees, you do you, very much tailored to the individual. There's been this balance recently, and this was kind of underpinning the survey as well, in terms of some organisations being persuasive in terms of what they want to see, how often they want to see employees return to the workplace. Other organisations, again, still being quite hands-off and letting employees sort of decide themselves. So there's been a little bit of a shift in terms of that, from all-out employee empowerment to choose exactly what they want to do, to this kind of balance, and this is where some of the survey results really come into play. But the kind of main message is that employees really have influenced the plans moving forward, and it's always good. It's always good for staff to see the actions that are being taken from the consultations, because if you consult with employees, and you have done a lot throughout the last 18 months to 2 years, and then employees haven't really influenced the plans going forward, that's going to disengage them pretty quickly. So it's not just listening to employees and hearing them, but also having done something about that. And this is the kind of doing something about it phase that a lot of organisations are in. So not only positive in terms of the amount we've connected with employees, but also then doing something about it is always important. The next area is the different formats of the return to the workplace. So a large number of organisations have this kind of hybrid way of working, or an expectation of this hybrid way of working, with either a set number of days for employees to come back in, with the other days being flexible in terms of where they work, or if it's not a set number of days, it could be ad hoc but based on business needs. And business needs could mean either the departmental briefings, specific team issues. So that I've heard a number of clients indicate that it's always really useful to get people in on a certain day to be able to sort of brainstorm and bounce ideas off each other. So again, it's on the basis of business needs, but with that degree of flexibility for the days that you don't need to be in. So there's this real kind of hybrid ways of working that's coming into play for a number of organisations. The key here, I guess, is for organisations to sort of take that step back and look and think about when we really need employees in as a sort of criticality, and then setting the parameters around what that looks like, but then providing employees with the flexibility to choose how and where they work outside of that. Important here to keep testing, whilst avoiding survey fatigue can be quite difficult balance to strike, but the kind of really short, sharp, snappy pulse surveys can help you kind of keep testing and keep understanding how employees are reacting to returning to the work, whilst trying to avoid that survey fatigue. But easier said than done. We acknowledge that. Next, in terms of the drivers for returning to work. So Significantly, well-being and collaboration were significantly the two largest drivers of the return to workplace. So we've heard a number of organisations over the last few months really taking the time to understand why do we actually need to, employees to come back into the workplace that haven't been previously. What is really the reason behind this, and significant that those two areas are kind of covering mental and social well-being is a real kind of the well-being and the duty of care angle is really present here. So last year, going back to 2020, it's quite hard not to keep going back to 2020 because it's such a sort of natural split of the ways that things have progressed throughout this period. But back in 2020, there were a lot of fears about productivity, the impact of productivity, especially immediately once we all had to come back and work from home. But interestingly, 31% of organisations who responded to the survey actually said there was no impact, that productivity had no impact on their return to work plans, which suggests that the way that we all work hasn't actually disrupted productivity as much as we maybe originally thought back in 2020, and that employees, ultimately have been contributing, have been providing outcomes and outputs consistently with before the pandemic. So again, quite a sort of positive message to provide. It's one thing just having the drivers there, but what's really important is explaining the why and having your guiding principles in place. And we're encouraged by how many organisations had the guiding principles in place, even if you haven't communicated them just yet. Again, 2020 was quite patchy in terms of organisations that had that joined up approach, but I think there'll be a lot of emphasis, as we talk about employees having being at the forefront of plans and having more accountability for the way they work. I think there will automatically be questions that organisations might face on, okay, so why are we actually in the office? Why are we doing this? And having those guiding principles really kind of signifies the why as well, not just the what. And this kind of made us think forward as well. So going into the autumn, fingers crossed that everything goes to plan from here. But as we've seen in the past, how likely that is open to question. But if we were then locked down again in the autumn or in the winter, are we prepared for that as an HR function? Are we prepared for that? Not just from a logistical side of, point of view, but even in terms of having those guiding principles, are we ready to sort of explain the why we need to do things when we then come out of the lockdown again in future? We'll have this period to help us through that. We'd have kind of tested the water, but the guiding principles are really core to helping employees to understand why we're working where we are and how we're working, and what that means. And then finally, in terms of the frequency of return, so okay, this is all well and good, but how often are employees expected to be back in the office? So the quick answer really is 2 to 3 days. So that was the vast majority of responses signified either 2 or 3 days per week, either depending on that business need or a set 2 to 3 days a week. It is caveated slightly in terms of right now, we've heard sort of anecdotal evidence of companies trialing 1 day a week for now, to try and sort out their logistics of having different groups of different numbers of employees in at different times, what that means in practice. The health and safety aspect as well, trialing that. Our office is overwhelmed if we've sold some of our estate, is what's left overwhelmed by the number of employees that want to go back in. And also some organisations have trialled the sort of 1 day a week for now, just because there's still a large number of employees that haven't been double jabbed, and some employees are a bit reluctant to come back unless they are double jabbed. So all in all, it kind of depends on individual business need, and what that kind of looks like for maybe within different teams and different functions. An important point to sort of make here is that inevitably, and the 1 day a week does kind of signify this, there is a period of trial and error. It's important to sort of trial your plans, not be too wedded to them, keep gathering that feedback and keep testing those plans in place. And it's important to sort of communicate that as well. Be open and honest in your communications. This is a trial and error period. We're doing it for this, that, and the other reason, which is where the guiding principles come back into play, which helps set the foundation for the return to work effort. So again, the question I'd like to leave you with really is, do you have the guiding principles in place, and have you communicated them to employees so they understand why and what this means? Because we're likely to have to be agile in when and how we return employees back into the workplace in future. So we're an optimistic bunch at QCG. We'd like to think that this whole difficult, albeit difficult period has provided some opportunities, and we'd like to focus on two for the rest of this webinar. So we'll talk about them in more detail shortly, but in terms of the employee value proposition, so this new way of working, it's important to sort of retest and understand what employees really want. The pandemic may well have shifted what employees really value for a large number of them, and also potential candidates. So there could be things like job stability, job security, could actually be more important now for employees than previously. Things like the commute and the working environment, obviously very topical and has been brought to our attention, but it could be absolutely critical for some employees where it might not have been 12 to 18 months ago. So when did you last test what employees really value, and what do they really want moving forward, is the opportunity here, which we'll come into in more detail. The other big impact and the other big opportunity we see is in terms of performance management and performance development. So we've seen difficulties in measuring employees' contribution through time and effort and inputs, and naturally having that shift towards looking at the contribution and the outputs of employees. That's kind of naturally given, and it's kind of this forced autonomy that we've had to give employees to go and continue to do their job, even though we can't see exactly what they're doing and how they're doing it. So with that being the case, does it now make more sense to empower your employees in terms of performance management? Is your current approach to performance management achieving the intended aims? And that's something that we'll explore shortly. So first of all, in terms of the employee value proposition, here are two main areas that we see has been directly impacted by the pandemic. So the first one on the left-hand side there, in terms of working conditions, pretty intuitive. We've had this period, as I said earlier, of sort of forced flexibility when the pandemic first hit, but now we're looking forward, and flexibility back then kind of meant where you work. We're now looking forward at the sort of new world of work flexibility. So what does flexible working mean moving forward? What it does mean is that employees are expecting, I think, a degree of choice in the way they work and when they work and how they work. And the key question here, and then the key consideration here, is to not assume that all employees, want to come back in the office and all of them want to still work from home. It's about understanding those individual circumstances and testing and measuring how much employees sort of want to go in versus how much you're forcing them to go in. It's quite a difficult balance to strike in terms of business need, but keeping employees at the heart of the return to the workplace efforts. Because we know, and to summarise, we know that when employees have greater choice and flexibility, when they're happier and healthier, it ultimately impacts on productivity and business success, which is a key consideration for us in all our consulting work in terms of that bottom line. So what does this all mean? The other area is in terms of organisational identity. So now that organisations, again, if I look back to 2020 as one period in time, massive firefighting, degree of firefighting going on by organisations, still the case in 2021, but now we are coming to what does this mean? And there's definitely more future looking here. What does this mean moving forward? We've had a good degree of space for organisations to reevaluate and re-establish their purpose. So what are we really there to do as an organisation? And again, going back to employee expectations, I think employees are now wanting more from their organisations. They don't just want organisations to make a profit. There's lots of considerations in terms of environmental and social governance. This was happening a bit before the pandemic, of course. It's not just the pandemic that's brought this into light, but what is important is that your employer branding is as accurate and as possible and has been updated if the company's mission and purpose and aims have changed in the past 12 months or so. Because what this essentially does is it opens up doors to wider recruitment pools. So if you're an organization that stands for very specific impacts on business success, what does that mean for society? You're more likely to attract a wider range of employees that need to sort of work flexibly and need to sort of have an identity that's more in line with the organization. So for example, those with caring responsibilities, those with disabilities, there's been lots of words bandied around and buzz phrases such as corporate social governance, diversity and inclusion, but what does that mean in practice? And does your organization, is that actually part of the purpose, is a key question here. So looking forward, in terms of your branding, you've been sending employees a lot of messages, whether you mean to or not, in the past sort of 6 to 12 months. But importantly, as we look forward, what messages are you sending employees in the next 1 to 2 years is a key question to think of moving forward. So just a few things to keep in mind with the employee value proposition. First of all, and this is a very difficult one to avoid, and we've heard this from clients that it has been, is a risk of a them and us culture for those employees who naturally sort of can't do the job from home versus those that have had to work in the field. Or it's been very difficult to, there's been, so it's unfair that some employees get to work from home, and then it's unfair that other employees, some organizations have tried to make adjustments in terms of pay or allowances for those that have to work on site, and then it's unfair on them, and you get a sort of right mess trying to balance this out. So what we have heard though is the shift to a more of a balanced approach for field workers. And it all starts really with the redefining of flexibility. So a few years ago, if I think of the consulting that we were doing with clients, it was more, can you work? Flexible working was a bit of a unique selling point for organizations, and it was essentially people can work from home. That unique selling point has pretty much completely gone because a large number of organizations now clearly have cohorts of staff that are working from home. So really taking the time to redefine what flexible working means, and specifically for those field workers, and doing what you can to cater for those who have to work on site is crucial moving forward. So it's not just about where you work, it's about the times that you can work, being flexible in your shifts, even flexible in your lunch break. The little things will make a difference. Job sharing, part-time, full-time working. So I've heard of a couple of organizations recently who have only just introduced part-time roles, which to me was surprising, but it just shows there is a long way to go. So once you define what flexibility means for you past just where you work, you can then start to reach out to different parts of the organization, and you can even go as far as to have 2 sets of policies or 2 interpretations of a set of flexible guiding principles to really ensure that you're engaging with different groups of employees equally and taking the time to understand what they're after from a flexible workforce. The second point here is in terms of personalization. So not just a one-size-fits-all approach to your interpretation of your employee value proposition, but translating that and how that applies to different parts of the business, in their own language is crucial. So if a massive part of your employee value proposition is flexible working, because that's essentially what we're talking about here, use that as an example, then what does that mean for those different cohorts? What does it mean for home workers versus field workers? What does it mean for the people who, if you're in a retail space, what does it mean for frontline shop assistants versus those who work in finance and HR? So it's a good reminder, I think, to ensure that your overarching employee value proposition is then translated to different parts of the business, which can then have a really good impact in terms of your diversity and inclusion, so everyone feels that the employee value proposition is understood and appropriate for them. And finally, in terms of communications, the importance of continuous messaging. We know that communications work best when you engage and communicate with employees across multiple channels. So going back to the survey results and the key headlines, been really good to hear that organisations have been using the surveys, the one-to-one conversations, the departmental briefings, etc. And also the importance of being honest here. I feel like now, as much as ever, employees are really in tune when you are or when you aren't being sort of open and authentic. So it's okay to be honest, especially around, we are all still in difficult circumstances. So having that trial and error period, particularly with the return to the workplace, it's kind of okay to be, honest about that. As long as we have a set of principles in place and there's parameters in place, we can then say, look, if something's not quite working, let's communicate with employees. Let's, understand what they need, and then the actions from that. And we can be open and honest around the testing that's involved in this, because it's very unlikely that everyone's going to get it right first time, particularly as employees move back into the office between now and September, when the schools go back. And what does this mean in terms of performance management and performance development? We see this as a really good opportunity for a shift in this. So we've already spoken about the kind of employee-centric approach, them having their work measured more on contribution and outcomes. So what does this mean in terms of the traditional approach of managing performance? So with the pandemic opening up more sort of natural accountability for individuals, is it time for managers to let go a little bit? And we've heard a lot over the past few years, and in particular about line managers really struggling with the whole performance management approach. So is this time to introduce, or is this an opportunity to introduce more employee input throughout the process? So I'm just going to take you through what this could look like for the remainder of this webinar before we get onto our questions. So first of all, in terms of a collaborative approach, so including employees right from the start of the process, instead of managers having this kind of one-off, we set you objectives, then we measure it throughout the year, and then possibly we rate it, and then we attach a reward to it. Is this more of an opportunity to change the emphasis and have employees as really central for setting their own objectives? And then the manager's role would change to more kind of providing guidance and validating those objectives, and also critically linking those individual objectives with departmental and business goals, all of which should and can be flexible. So again, if we all go into lockdown again in the autumn, do we have the flexibility to change our goals in the year, or at least do we have that in mind that may happen? Because if it becomes very clear throughout the process that you can't achieve your goals because of external factors, then it can actually be incredibly demotivating for employees. This is also a good opportunity to kind of change the goals just from output and delivery. A lot of organizations wrapping in the how as well as the what, so having behaviors included as well, but also development, introducing employees' broader development in there, and having an employee as kind of front and central to that makes a lot of sense. And by having employees invested in the goal setting and the objectives of performance management, they kind of now have a vested interest in kind of owning their own development, in owning their own performance, and owning the process alongside managers. We're not just saying employees should do it all themselves, but it's important for to have them more included than they have been naturally so far. The second area is in terms of the frequency of communications. There's been a lot of literature suggesting that organisations are starting to change the kind of one-off annual review, looking backward, to a more kind of frequent, the more little and often conversations throughout the year. And if employees and managers have kind of this equal accountability in setting the goals, they should also have equal accountability in arranging and having those frequent communications. So, and again, being able to look forward and look to the present rather than just look backwards will help this become easier throughout the year. So instead of rating how an employee has done, maybe having that conversation about how they're doing, and having that joint accountability, not only for having the conversations, but also the kind of follow-ups afterwards. It's something that we do at QCG. We encourage employees to take as much charge of their own development and their own next steps from each conversation as much as the people that manage them do as well. So what does this mean for the role of the manager? Again, a difficult one to get right, possibly easy to say on paper, but by removing the kind of rigidity around performance management, you can really start to focus on the role of the line manager changing from thinking about the outcome, the final rating, the link with financial rewards, more towards the process. So managers they sort of change from being judge, jury and executioner throughout the year, and the one you have to impress all the time, to enablers of performance and providing the right level of guidance and challenge for employees to set the right level of stretch in their goals, identifying barriers to effective performance management and effective contribution to the organisation, having that alignment of individuals with the wider team, the organisational goals, cultures and values, and again linking back in with the behaviours that stem from that, and also employees' individual development. So the role of the manager changes to one more of a supportive coach, asking the right questions and a bit more hands-off rather than this kind of dictator figure, which can all too easily happen in certain organisations. And one of those barriers to success that we often hear is the final point here, which is the links with reward. So by linking reward with performance management, we often hear that it actually acts as a barrier to effective management of performance. And particularly in this scenario, so in this sort of performance development approach that we're recommending, it can also impact the goal setting right at the start. So, if you know that there's financial reward attached, there could be, a bias involved in both employees and managers in terms of not setting the goals with enough stretch, not particularly being bothered about linking them in with company objectives. Whereas if you decouple this, it really gives you an opportunity to focus on the collaborative approach, the support, the line manager changing to more of that supportive coach, and really trying to get performance development linked in with essentially how you want the company to achieve and contribute, and how that then translates to individuals. If you really do want to link an element of rewards with performance management, then we'd recommend doing that in terms of recognition, rather than the kind of one-off annual bonus that we see at the end of the year. If you're having, and it kind of makes sense, if you're having those frequent communications throughout the year, why then wait until the end of the year to then sort of officially have this rigid approach to then rating and providing reward? If you have a recognition scheme, financial or even non-financial, from the back of those frequent communications, you can kind of see how employees are doing, how they're progressing, if they're provided an outstanding contribution or really developing, over and above expectations. You can then immediately provide them with a sort of recognition award, and a more of a sort of little and often approach in terms of reward also makes sense when you align it to the sort of little and often approach to having those communications and those performance management conversations. So is the opportunity there, and is this unfortunate situation we find ourselves in, and specifically where we are in terms of trying to move forward from this now, a good opportunity to take that fresh look at performance management? It's just something worth thinking about.